going to walk you through an exercise that I use to teach my students about systemic disparate treatment and disparate impact. There's a formal teaching note explaining this exercise on the website in connection with the Employment Discrimination and Employment Law textbook. But if you just want to download a blank copy of the exercise, there's a link to it in the description of this YouTube video. I developed this exercise because my students were always just so overwhelmed when I tried to teach them the statistical components of a systemic disparate treatment and disparate impact claim. For them, it was like drinking out of a waterfall, and they would try for 5 seconds, and once it became in their minds too hard, they would just give up, and then they would show up in my office right before the exam and beg for topics relating to statistics to be not on the exam at all. But I found that if I used this exercise, they were very engaged and they didn't seem fearful of these causes of action. And in fact, I put them on my exam this year, and almost all of them got it right, even though the exam questions required them to calculate and analyze some numbers and compare which disparate impact claim was viable and which one wasn't. At heart, the exercise consists of having students populate the statistics associated with the Teamsters case and the Hazelwood case, using the information that's already in the case. So what I'll do is I'll make flip charts like this that are blank with little boxes around the figures that appear in the case. And then what I instruct them to do is fill in those numbers and then calculate the rest of the numbers based on what they already have in the case. And then we discuss it as a group. And I think the experience of being able to identify the relevant numbers and then figure out the rest of them themselves, even though it only involves like 3rd or 5th grade math, gives them a feeling of competence about the numbers and a familiarity with the numbers that they're then able to assess arguments about which sorts of statistics are persuasive and which sorts of statistics are not. So I'll put them in groups and have each group fill out one of these that represents a different statistical figure or argument in the Teamsters or Hazelwood case, as you can see in the blank worksheet. And then I have them all tape each of their flip charts to the board like this, next to the number on the board. And then we sort of stand around and look at the flip charts and discuss them and figure out, I ask them which ones are persuasive, which statistics are not persuasive, and why, and we make various statistical arguments and counter-arguments, and these are actually BU undergrads, but I think also the process of sort of standing and looking and discussing informally leads students to feel a little bit more comfortable to talk about statistics. Here's what you'll need in order to run this exercise. It takes a little bit of time to obviously review the cases in advance of class, and it takes a sort of non-trivial sum of time to actually prepare the flip charts, but I think it's worth it in terms of the engagement level that you get from the students. So the first thing I do with the students is put up a blank flip chart for the first set of numbers in the Teamsters case, and I fill it out with the students so they see how the exercise works. If you're short on time, you can fill out the numbers in this chart in advance. So here is an abstracted version of that same flip chart. So what I'll tell them is we're going to reproduce the statistics in the Teamsters and Hazelwood case, and that each group is going to be assigned to prepare one set of statistics from the case. Okay, so the first thing for them to understand is this, what does it mean to have expected number, right? So expected number refers to the number of people you would expect in that position if the hiring for that position was proportional to the representation in the left-hand column. Each flip chart has a different metric for evaluating, in this case, the qualified applicant pool. So the key inference here that they might not be accustomed to dealing with is looking at the representation in the applicant pool and then calculating the expected number of people in that position based on that representation. So we start with that. So first we look at what is the representation of Black and Latino employees in all positions in the company in Teamsters. And you can readily find that in the case, right? And so you fill it in right here. Okay. The next thing I ask them is if they hired in the line driver position proportional to the representation in the whole company, what would be the percentage of Black and Latino employees you expect in the line driver position? It would be 5% and 4%, right? You're just copying this number here and putting it here. That's easy. They can do that. No problem, right? We also know the total number of employees in the line driver position from the case. This actually should be highlighted in blue. The blue highlights, represent numbers that are in the case that they don't have to figure out. Okay, so once you know that this is 5% and this is 1828, you can multiply the two and figure out that this is the actual number of people you would expect to have in that position if you were hiring at a 5% and 4% level. So you're pretty close to being done. This is not that hard, right? The next thing is to go and look at the case and find the actual number of Black and Latino employees that are in that position. And that's right in the case. You can find that. The next step is to calculate the percentage representation based on the actual number of hiring, which you just do by dividing 8 by 1828, and you end up at 0.4%, etc. Okay, so you can see that their hiring rate is about 1/10 the rate that you would expect if they were hiring proportional to representation in the overall company, right? 0.4% divided by 5% is a pretty small number. Okay, so then what I tell them is, I want you're going to do this yourself in a group. So I want each group to take a flip chart and a few markers and a piece of tape and fill in the numbers on their flip chart, keeping in mind that they're going to need to pay attention to whatever the metric is right here for applicant pool, and then find the numbers in the case that are indicated by the blue highlighting in the particular flip chart they have. While they're working on it, I tend to go around and look to see how they're doing to make sure that they're on track so that we're not wasting time later correcting their mistakes in front of the whole class. I tend to correct as they go along. Then I ask everyone to come up to the front of the classroom, which doesn't work as well if you have a very large class. You might just have one group at a time come to the front of the classroom, but everyone's sort of standing and looking at their chart and other people's charts. And then I ask them to make various statistical arguments about what they see. So the first set of questions I ask relate to the qualified applicant pool. So having looked at the numbers themselves very carefully and thought about what this number means, I then ask them to look at this column for all of the charts and ask which of the various applicants pool do they think is the best point of comparison or the least point of comparison, and why, right? And so that gives them an entree into the various arguments that the parties make in these types of cases about which is the correct reference category to be using, which generally relates to which number is most favorable to them. Okay, so I asked them to make arguments and counter arguments and which numbers they would select if they represented the plaintiff or defendant. One of the things that's not in the Teamsters or Hazelwood case is the actual applicant flow. So one of the other things I ask is, what would be the ideal applicant flow, the ideal metric for comparing a company's hiring rate, and they eventually, someone will volunteer that's the actual applicant flow. So then we talk about what might be the circumstances in which actual applicant flow either wouldn't be available or wouldn't be the best way to measure the qualified applicant pool. And, and that's all from the cases here, right? But I'm having them reason through it based on the numbers they see in front of them. Okay, the next thing that I do is have them look at the differences in selection rates. So looking at the difference between these numbers and these numbers. And I ask them, do you think for any particular chart, do you think that these differences are big or small? Without regard to sort of statistical calculations, in their experience, do you think these numbers are big or small? So from this, they're actually able to make pretty good statistical inferences even without knowing anything about math, which is like, if this number is 0, that's pretty meaningful, regardless of what any of the other numbers say, although it's partly a factor of whether this is a large number or a small number, and if this number, the sample size, is pretty small, then these numbers are less meaningful. But another important question that they figure out on their own is the difference between this number, and how big the difference is will sometimes dictate whether they think the statistical difference is large, right? The other inference they tend to be able to make themselves is the difference between 8 people and 91 people. That's a lot of people. So you're getting to questions of practical significance, right? There are 80 people that are affected by this difference. That's a lot of people, and so maybe that's a big difference that we should care about. The last question I tend to ask them is to try and understand some of the more sophisticated arguments the parties make. In particular, why does it matter that the St. Louis County aspires to hire a 50% African American teacher level, and why might that matter in the Hazelwood case, and what are the basis for their arguments about post-act discrimination as opposed to pre-act discrimination, which they can figure that out from the arguments in the case, right? So they're extracting out the arguments in the case. This is a way of having a Socratic dialogue about the case and the arguments in the case, but they're sort of coming up with the arguments on their own. Okay, so after we've done that whole overview, I then do tend to explain 2 statistical metrics that are introduced in the textbook, and that's the 80% rule and the statistical significant test. And once they've done these statistics, it's actually very intuitive for them to calculate the 4/5 rule, because they're really just comparing this number to this number, the numbers in this column from that column, and you can tell if the differences, if the selection rates are within 80% of each other, or if they're really far off. Like, this is something that comes pretty easily to students. I also explain the statistical significance test to them, and it does tend to be much easier once they've looked at all these numbers and processed them themselves. So one analogy I use is a roulette wheel. So, like, let's say you were spinning a roulette wheel with a 5% chance of landing on a particular square. So using the numbers in Teamsters, I said, basically, if you spun the roulette wheel 1,800 times, what's the likelihood that you would only land on that square 8 times, with a 5% chance, right? So you're really just looking back at this. If you spun it 1,800 times with a 5% chance, what would you expect? How many times would you expect to land on that square? It's 91, right? So what are the odds that actually, if you were spinning the wheel with a 5% chance, you would only end up with 8? You would only land on that square 8 times. What's the likelihood of that? And I think students can figure out, based on looking at these statistics, that it's not likely at all that you would land on it only 8 times. And in fact, if you run the numbers, it's less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that this would arise by chance, that you would, in a roulette context, you would land on this 8 times by chance. If you were gambling, you would assume that the wheel was stacked, right? So I think it's sort of intuitive for students once you've shown them the chart. And it helps them understand that the statistical significant test does not show that discrimination was the true reason why the employees weren't hired, but it rules out chance as an explanation for what happened. So if you'd like the teaching note with an answer key in it, feel free to email me, or I can get you the credentials for the textbook website.